Hello, friends, and welcome to our third week of our Lenten study called Watching the Disciples and Learning from Their Mistakes. We've been doing this series remembering that the disciples were ordinary people called to do extraordinary things. And sometimes we think they are extraordinary people called to do extraordinary things, but within their ordinariness, maybe we can find ourselves and we recognize that they were not perfect, just as we are not perfect. But maybe the mistakes that they made are some mistakes that we've made, and maybe learning from them, we can learn how to better be disciples and followers of Christ. So today, as we move into our lesson, I want to share my screen with you and also to talk about what we're talking about today. Today we're talking about the idea of an agenda, listening to our plan instead of sometimes God's plan for us. And I'm sure that each of us can relate in some ways to this particular piece of understanding. And one of the things that we talk about in there is, well, who is it that we follow? And a question that pops into our head was, when was the time you listened to another person's idea or plan for you to follow that was really contrary to how you were feeling called to act? And how did you handle that? And how did you know that the plan that you felt called was the best plan for you, the best idea for you to go forward? Well, for the disciples, Jesus offered them a different kind of plan. He offered them something different than what they had seen. But before he got there, Jesus himself was called to a plan that maybe he did not think of himself, although I think he certainly knew who he was. He knew that he was to go and bring people into the kingdom. But there was going to be a part of his journey that was going to be extraordinarily hard. And after having spent 30 some years on earth, very human and doing all the human things, he was going to be asked to go to the next step, something that was daunting, something that was going to be extraordinarily painful and hard to get through. And so once he accepted this calling at his baptism, he went into the desert for 40 days and into the wilderness, depending upon the translation that you read. There's a picture that really has always spoken to me regarding this time that Jesus spent out in the wilderness. And it's by a fellow named Britton Revere, and I probably have butchered that, so forgive me. But it's called The Temptation of Christ. And it's in this time of being out all by himself, of fasting, but being tended to by angels, that we see him really coming to grips with what the next 3 years will engage him in and entangle him in, and the difficulties associated with that. I think Jesus, faced some of the same temptations that we did. He had to always, or he always picked the higher calling, but he witnessed to the temptations of the world. And I think this is important that we think about this, because one of the things that makes Jesus relatable to us is really in his humanness, where we know that he understands the temptations that we face, the struggles that we face. But in his time in the wilderness, he sorted out and affirmed this calling that was upon him. And when he was tested 3 different times by the one who wanted to pull him away from the task that was there, he had to affirm for himself what was it that he was going to follow. So when we get into understanding that, Jesus knew the agenda set before him. He knew what he was called to do. Therefore, when the temptation came, he knew how to respond to it. And remember that he was first tempted that he could have all the food of the world. This is what you would do to a hungry man, isn't it? You offer to fill his stomach momentarily, but you forget to fill his spirit eternally. And so Jesus responds to that temptation with these maybe familiar words to you. It is written, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. So he knew the problem with temporary cessation of whatever it was we wanted if it did not lead to long-term fulfillment of the spiritual thirst. When he was attempted with performing a miracle act on demand, to show, what he would be able to do, Jesus responded with these words from scripture. It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Meaning, don't, coming into faith isn't a if then statement. It isn't a show me kind of statement. It is an internal kind of statement that has trust and faithfulness in God, even when things on the outside do not look as positive as they might otherwise be. And finally, when the tempter came to him and said, if you worship me, I can give you all of these lands of the earth. And Jesus knew then that there was only one follower, and he wanted his people to know that there was only one follower. And Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Well, we face these similar temptations. We face temptations of things that we want to be satisfied with quickly. We face temptations to, if you will, throw the gauntlet down before God and ask him to act in a certain way or on our behalf in a certain situation, or to do something for us instead of living a life that does something for him. And then we are also guilty of sometimes wanting to worship other things besides God and to serve other things besides God. And so we know that there is an agenda set before us. There was an agenda set before Christ. But sometimes for his disciples, they were not satisfied with the agenda there. You see, the more we read about the expectations of the Israelite people, the more we get the understanding that the Messiah they expected was going to look different than the Messiah that they got. They were thinking more of a warrior king or a conquering government or a vindictive leader, somebody that would do away with all the oppression and mistreatment that they had experienced up until now and be replaced with their leader. There's the one. But they were putting on their Messiah the same human qualities that humanity's been putting on leaders, political leaders, national leaders for years. And Jesus came as a different kind of leader. And so they kept trying to attempt to turn him from the task and do it in a way different because they wanted their own agenda fulfilled. But when Jesus stepped forward to the people, he said to these people, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. He didn't say, follow me and I'll make you part of a large military troop. Follow me and we'll overtake the world. Follow me and people will bow before us and we will get our vengeance back. He didn't come with that kind of a message. He said, come and follow me. And following him looked very different than anything else that they had seen in the world. Now, to be a leader, sometimes that means you have to sit in the second chair. We have that term in corporate language. There's the CEO and then the one that serves under the CEO. There's the senior pastor and one that serves as the associate pastor. There's the senior leader, whatever it may be, and the junior intern, if you will. Well, Jesus was really asking his disciples that there's an agenda already set for us, and the agenda is set for us by God. And I want you to follow me, who is the closest to God, and then you're going to then go and lead others likewise. There's something about the second chair. Sometimes people think that that's a less than position. But, to lead wherever you are, to be in that position of leadership, everybody in second chair leads the people in the third chair, and so on and go. We're all reaching back always and bringing the next one up. So in that way, we all become leaders as we point people in the direction to follow Christ. But the leader, the real leader, is someone who does as God has instructed, as God has commanded, as shown through the life of Jesus. So the life of Jesus is really what we want to be leading others to, but it's also what we want to be following in our own personal discipleship. Well, like I said, sometimes the disciples, they suggested or questioned Jesus' agenda because it more often reflected their own desires and goals than his. Now, any organization faces the same dilemma. Sometimes people come into an organization and we know that organizations have vision or mission statements, things that they want to appeal to. But someone else comes in with an idea and they go, well, you know what I think we ought to be doing? And if it's not assessed and looked at and talked about, then we really don't know Are they really within the vision and the mission statement of this organization? Or is there something else that is calling them to do something different? There's times when I will look at businesses and I'm just reminded of this. Let's take a car dealership. A car dealership is to sell new and used cars and to provide maintenance for some. Well, if a new employee came in there and go, I think we ought to be offering fresh bread and milk when people are here because it will keep them from stopping at the store if they come in to buy for a car. And someone would look up and say, well, that's ludicrous. You would never do that. Well, but you see, if somebody isn't on the same page, then you can see how that begins to diminish the vision and the mission that is being called for. And so one of the things that the disciples had to get in their head was finding out what Jesus' calling was so that they knew what their own calling was. And to look at this, we're looking at a scripture found in the Gospel of Matthew. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. This was his following. This is his mission. This is what he has been called to do. But he has an objection from Peter. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. Jesus turned to Peter and said to him, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in the mind of the things of God, but the things of men. Then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will find it. What good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world and yet forfeits his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? Well, Jesus has taken his disciples aside and he's revealed to them the agenda, that which has been set before him, that which was his calling, that which he was in that wilderness experience coming to grips with, if you will. And what is Peter's response? He's like the person who shows up at the car dealership and suggests they sell bread. No, he's got a different agenda. This is not fitting with the agenda that Peter thought was going to be there. And Peter says, never, Lord, this shall never happen to you. Isn't it interesting that Peter thought he knew more than Jesus? And one of the first things about being a follower is to understand that when the leader sets the course, you get in step with that. See, prior to his words, Peter had already stated that he believed Jesus to be the Messiah. He believed him to be the rock, the foundation of the church, because he thought it was going to look different. Peter thought he knew what was going to be best for Jesus. And this, when he said, this is the Messiah, this isn't what he thought it was going to look like. But Jesus had told them earlier, he said, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So he's trying to remind Peter that we're looking at a heavenly view, not necessarily at an earthly view. I don't know, perhaps Peter thought he'd been given more authority than he actually had. Maybe Peter thought that this, as a high-ranking disciple, he shouldn't have to be in this suffering. And suffering and death certainly didn't fit the agenda, of what he perceived the Messiah to be bringing. This was not the right path for a successful kingdom in Peter's mindset. And he was trying to change Jesus' mindset. Well, when we listen to the rebuke, he says that Jesus says this to him, get behind me, Satan, you are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. Where else did we hear Jesus offer this same rebuke? We heard him say that same rebuke when he was in the wilderness. And he said this to one who was calling him to be worshiped. And you see the similarity here. Jesus is reminding Peter, I didn't come to be worshiped. We only worship God the Father. And he says, you are going to be a stumbling block if you don't move this agenda of yours out of the way, because you're thinking more about the things that mankind sees as leadership, humankind sees as leadership, than what God sees as that. So when a time when Jesus needed support, what were we finding within Peter? We're finding him wanting to pursue his own agenda. So Peter was balking at what was laying ahead for them because he thought that surely nothing good could possibly come out of that. And it makes me wonder, we often speak of the betrayal of Christ in the work of Judas Iscariot. But to me, this is a little act of betrayal on Peter's part. Peter doesn't fully bought in. He doesn't fully understand who Jesus is. And he doesn't understand that sometimes following is going to lead to heartache and burden because of it. Now, I will ask, if we move back into the secular world, sometimes we, want to suggest to leaders of a better way. We've got better ideas and we think things ought to do differently. Yet we're not willing to wear, if you will, the title of leadership if it comes into suffering and burden. And I know that there are many who are senior leaders of organizations who lay awake at night and they feel deeply burdened by the steps sometimes they have to take in their corporate world, if you will. People they have to lay off, or financial burdens or whatever. And when someone else comes in and they want to suggest to you, when you know the path forward that's best for yours, it's not helpful. It becomes a stumbling block in the organization. So this is the similar kind of language, if we relate it into what we see in the secular world, is Jesus is going, Peter, you got to be all in. And to be all in means there's got to be suffering too. And that means that people are not always going to understand us, and people are not always going to follow and do what we need them to do. But we have to stay true to the course that has been set before us. And at times that might be a painful thing. Well, the second thing that the disciples tried to do is they tried to resist then what Jesus was going to walk through and what Jesus experienced. And for this, we get to the story in John chapter 11. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. So what they're introducing us here is this great close relationship that they all have. Well, when Jesus heard this, Jesus said, the sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Jesus loved Mary and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Even in crisis of one family, Jesus needed to be where he was. But he sent word of assurance that it's going to be okay. Then the disciples said to him, let us go back to Judea. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago, the Jews tried to stone you, and you want to go back there? So instead of going to see this Lazarus who's sick, you want to go back to Judea where they've been mean to you? This makes no sense to us. You should be beholding to your friend. You should not be going back to speak to these leaders. They're trying to pull Jesus off his agenda with resistance to what it is that he's telling them. Let's pick back up. Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by this world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light. Well, after this, he had said this, he went to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, and I'm going to wake him up. And his disciple replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, I'm glad I was not there so that you may believe. But let us go to him. And then Thomas, called Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, let us go also that we may die with him. I love this picture. This is by Van Gogh. There are so many pictures about Lazarus coming out of the tomb. A lot of them have him wrapped, mummified, if you will, in different periods of art history show this portrayal in a different one. I particularly like this one because you see the stress of the sisters in this. and we see the light shining out there. And so we see this entombment, if you will, and them recognizing that he is dead, and you see their expressions to show the severity of the situation. So I want us to pause and think about this. Jesus has learned that his friend, his dear friend, who he says in scripture he cared very much for, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, is dead. And instead of dropping everything and rushing to his bedside, he decides instead to go back and continue to try to speak to people, to bring them into relationship with who he is and who God the Father is. Well, his disciples are just not getting any of this. And so, they keep saying, well, you need to, come back. And he goes, the light has to go where the light needs to go. And the light needs to shine upon these people. And then he says, Lazarus is asleep, and they just still don't get it. And he says, he's told them that he's going to be glorified in this situation. But isn't it odd, as we look at this story, that we can relate to that? I mean, we don't want to go back to dangerous situations, do we? That's like saying, I know that I'm going back to some people who don't want to listen to a word I have to say, and probably going to get enraged. They may throw stones at me. And, and so my friends would say to me, I don't think you need to go back there. I don't think you need to return there. I don't think that's a good situation for you to be at. And so, we can't wonder or question they're just wanting to keep Jesus safe. But if Jesus knew a better idea and knew that there was work there to be done, then it was, that they should be following what he has to say. And so Jesus' response sometimes is a little bit cryptic, because he said, are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees this world's light. So when we talk about this, Jesus is about his work while he's here on earth, while it is still day. And he refuses to be hindered by whatever it is that is being held in Judea at that part. And so, he's saying, I'm here, and while I'm here, there is light and there is work to be done. So prior to this story, and what had happened in that story was he'd been in Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. And while he was speaking in the temple, he made the listeners so angry that they took up stones to stone him. So this is the fear that they're talking about, and it is natural to try to stay away from those dangerous situations. But for Jesus, it was unfinished business. And so he goes on to say, when it's time for them to move from darkness to light, that it's time for them to know that death is not going to be a stumbling block. When the day comes, when darkness comes upon the land, because I am no longer the light, I don't want you to see this as a stumbling block. So whatever dangers, darkness are there before you, you need to keep on going. And isn't it interesting that Thomas, the one who doubted, the one who needed to see the nail-scarred hands of Jesus, was the one that in this moment was spurring them on, because he said, let us go also that we may die with him. So you're seeing that he's beginning to get the idea that, well, we may not always understand it, but we're going to keep on following. Because when we talk about dying, it's dying to self here, so that we may fully understand him. In that particular instance, he was sure. Well, the disciples wanted to ensure their own safety as well. And there are other times in which the disciples pushed on their own agendas. Other times besides these two, and just for a few examples, let's look at this one. In Luke 9, we read that as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. And when the disciples, James and John, saw this, they asked, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and destroy them? But Jesus rebuked them, and they went to another village. They were setting their own agenda, that anyone who wasn't for you was against you, and they should be destroyed. For them, the agenda was, if you don't believe, then you vanish. And Jesus was going, that's not part of our agenda. Just because we've been rejected, it's not part of our agenda to become violent within that. This theme of violence would continue both in John and in the Gospel of Matthew. And it's two tellings of the same story, and I want to point out a couple of similarities and differences. In John, we read, then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? Well, in Matthew, it's the same story, but we don't hear him named as Simon Peter. With that, one of Jesus' companions drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. So this isn't the servant now, it's the priest himself. Jesus commands the same thing, but then he gives a reason for that. He said, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you not think I can call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? So Jesus is speaking to his power that they don't seem to get. They think that they have to use their hands in order for Jesus' work to be done, when Jesus wants them to touch the spirit of humankind. And ultimately, isn't that the truth? That no matter who you fight, eventually you will be dead by the fight. It's kind of like, a bully who's always meeting the bigger bully. It's like, that's never going to solve anything. I'm showing to you another piece of art. And here again, it's interesting to go and look at art and how different artists throughout the ages have interpreted this, oftentimes at the interpretation of the church. And so, in this one, when we read the story, and what we've often seen portrayed in movies is this group of people coming by night, and that, one of the disciples, and depending upon which version you read, strikes the ear of someone, either a servant or a high priest. And so, but this one just seems very much more, instead of just standing there and like on a whim reaching out and hitting someone. I mean, this one has a tackle scene with it, and a very aggressive kind of action. And so we hear in this scene, and we hear in all of them, of Jesus going, stop, we're not going to be violent. It's echoing that very same thing that we just heard earlier in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus' answer is not violence. And it would be this nonviolent theme that is played into more modern history, the work of Gandhi, the work of Martin Luther King Jr., the work of many who are, for social justice. But he's like, do you not think I could ask God to take care of this? We're not going to respond with violence. So with this action, was the disciples an attempt to protect Jesus, or more likely a retaliation born out of anger when threatened with defeat and possibly death? All these people knew in their culture was the powerful always respond violently to subdue and oppress the lesser. And so this was what the disciples had seen and known, and it was more about them being victorious than in their protection of Jesus. What is clear is that Jesus knew the agenda that he was going to follow, and that this was not the answer to it, that he had a leadership model that was very different than what the world had been seeing. And it so much different that meant that he died in order that the work might continue on there. So was Peter mistaken in thinking that Jesus would want him to use force to protect him for any reason? Yes, he was. Because Peter was not, again, recognizing the very power that Jesus possessed, and that he was missing the whole point. And when you think back, if you will, to all the scriptures, when they were asked, they asked him, what is the greatest commandment? Love your neighbor. Well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus showed him. It would be the one that they least likely might have thought of as neighbor. So all of those things that it's not taking full seed inside of them. And they're reacting in a worldly way instead of in a godly way. Well, what was clear was Jesus did not want violence. And so when we wrap it up today by looking at the disciples' mistakes, can we identify with them? As they mistakenly tried to impose their agenda on his. Don't we justify sometimes what we do? because we think that's the way God would have wanted it. Even if it means giving harm to someone else, even if it means casting out people, even if it means harming others in his name. More importantly, do we sometimes try to impose our agenda on others, thinking that we know better? People come to us and ask for leadership or guidance or something, and we think, well, I don't think you should do that. I think you should do this. When we've not taken the steps to really discern what would a godly plan be for them. And then when we get ready to discern pathways for ourselves or to help others besides that, maybe we should not be so glib sometimes in offering advice or direction before we have sought godly counsel in doing so. You know, we are built in community to do that. We are built in community to have others help us and for us to help others. But we always have to weigh what we're instructing others and what we see for ourselves to really say, will this pull me off the path of discipleship that God really wants me to do? Are we listening to one another? Are we praying for one another? And, and are we acting on our agenda? Like maybe someone wants to move, let's say, they've got a job before them, and they're trying to figure out, is this the best thing for me to do so that I can care for my family? And maybe we say, well, I don't really want to lose a good friend here because, they help me in so many ways. And so maybe I'm going to discourage them from going because I have a different agenda than they have. I don't have their best interest at heart sometimes. Well, what we saw with Jesus is Jesus often went away and he prayed and he spoke to God for guidance on the next situation. Maybe how to work with relationships with the people he had. What was it he needed to show them? What was it he needed to do? And he knew with conviction that he did not have the full authority. It was God's authority, and he was here to glorify that. Maybe the human Jesus could not bear the thought of going to the cross. But with consultation with God, he knew that that was the way we should be doing that. So when people have a path we want to question sometimes, we feel troubled or whatever, we need to do what the disciples did, what Jesus taught them to do, to ask God for strength and guidance, to pray for them as they discern what it is that God's agenda is for them. And instead of lashing out maybe with frustration and anger over their choices, maybe a private conversation and prayer in that community. And that's what Jesus was continually doing with his community. At times he rebuked them, but then he showed them what really was the answer here, what really was the best choice to be made. But in everything that we do, I think whatever it is, whether we're trying to help someone else or determine the best path for ourselves, this is the thing that we might want to look at. Which of the mistakes made by the disciples resonate with us? Which do we tend to do? And then the second thing is, when we look at our daily agenda or our yearly agenda or whatever, are we reminded what Jesus' agenda is for us as his disciples? Remember that just as we learned early on, Jesus wants us to have a life that's fulfilled and fulfilling for others. But he, above all, wants us to have a life that is focused for his glory. All the situations that we talked about today reflected back to God's glory. The temptation reflected back to God's glory. The story of raising Lazarus reflected back to God's glory. The story of not fighting back reflects back to God's glory. So what we're being asked for in this time of Lent is that we might pause and remember that maybe our troubles are because we're following our own agenda, and instead of following a life that is centered around God. And that's not to say that everything will be easy and carefree, just as Jesus demonstrated on that walk to the cross. But whatever hardship we suffer, as long as we know we're right with God in the midst of that, then that makes the suffering more bearable to be a part of that. So those are some things that you might look at as you go forward. in this week thinking about that? Am I trying to follow my agenda, or am I really sincere about following God's agenda? God's agenda for the world, which means it's going to be very different, just like it was in the disciples' day and in our days. Sometimes it looks like a very different place. So I ask that you join me in this closing prayer. So many times we've said, let not thy will be done. But we confess, O God, that words of our mouths may not be the meditation of our hearts. We want our will, not your will. We say to others and to ourselves that we're searching for your will. And yet, while Jesus spent 40 days in obedient discernment and testing, we find spending 40 minutes a week in prayer sometimes difficult. And sometimes we focus our energy on redirecting someone else's agenda. We pursue our agenda for our own lives, assuming that what we want is what you want. Forgive us, O God. As we continue this Lenten journey, call us into our own wilderness to reflect on your will. Quiet our distractions so that we can listen to you. Remind us daily of the agenda to which you have called us, to love you with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. Give us strength to pursue these commandments. Amen. Thank you, friends. Go in peace, and I'll look forward to seeing you again next week.